Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us today. And welcome to the BRC-A's Buying Power webinar series, and a big welcome to any newcomers today as well. If you are a newcomer, just to let you know that we hold webinars every 4 to 6 weeks on hot topics about and relating to corporate renewable energy procurement. So I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. For me in Sydney, that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Before we get started and introduce you to our expert panel, we've got some fantastic speakers today. Just a few things to mention. First of all, congratulations to our BRC-A members, Charter Hall and Ongi, on executing a PPA announced today, and also to Westpac and Flow Power on their PPA also announced last week. We have just released our newsletter, which is full of all of our latest news, events and training. So if you didn't receive a copy, please reach out via our website or email us directly and we will send you one. In terms of events, we will very soon be holding our long-awaited upcoming buyers training bootcamp in September. Dates to be advised, probably about mid-September, just before the school holidays in New South Wales, but at this stage it will also likely be held face-to-face in Sydney. We hold a bootcamp just a few times each year, and this is one of the first ones we've had in a while. It is the peak renewable energy and PPA procurement training course in Australia, held over 1.5 days, 3 learning modules that takes you right through from energy basics through nuts and bolts of renewable energy procurement and into advanced learning. It is strictly for corporate energy buyers only. We've got a great list of buyers faculty, so buyers who've done it before, who are going to be coming along. So please visit our website and register. A couple of other things just to mention quickly. We have our annual State of the PPA Market Report 2022 coming up that we will produce, and we will seek your inputs from whatever side of industry you're from in a whole of industry survey that really forms the basis for that annual report. So please just take 5 minutes to complete it if you can. It helps us to understand your needs better and what we need to do to support you. In the next couple of months, we're going to be launching our new online buyers diagnostic tool to help newcomers to get started on their renewable energy PPA or PPA journey. The tool will pose several questions, and based on your responses, it will recommend best options for you to explore and provides you with a tailored learning pathway. Finally, memberships have now expired for our supply side members in July this year. So if you haven't already renewed your membership, please jump on and do so at your earliest convenience. We are recording today's session for the benefit of those who can't make it. And we've also allowed time at the end. So if you have any questions, please put it into the chat and we will address as many of these as we can. So that's enough on that and housekeeping. So just on to today's topic, LGC pricing trends and the RET. As many as you know and already do, buying LGCs or large-scale generation certificates provides support for grid-connected renewable energy generation. And if you retire them, enables your organisation to make claims about decarbonisation, especially carbon neutral claims under Climate Active or 100% renewable claims under the RE100. Many of you will also know that LGCs have been experiencing a surprise price hike over the past year since June 2021. Yesterday, the spot market closed there for LGCs at $50.90, up from the low 30s this time last year. Price increases are being experienced across all vintages, with significant jumps in January this year, so forecast to increase prices further. This has surprised the market with predicted price decreases as the annual target was met and as we move closer to the end of the RET in 2030. Clean Energy Regulator's explanation focuses on material growth in the voluntary LGC market as companies seek to meet decarbonisation goals. New records have been set as 1.2 million LGCs were cancelled in the first quarter of 2022. This is 4 times the number for the same quarter last year. For corporates, this means increasing cost of buying. So what is happening? What can we expect in the near and longer term? And what do you need to do to manage this situation for your organisation? Today, we have experts from across industry. We have corporate buyer, we have 2 market experts, and we also have contracts expert to provide a range of perspectives. And just to note that today's discussion doesn't constitute advice. The main purpose is to provide you with a cross-section of views and insights. So before I hand over to Chris Briggs to ask the first question today, our technical director and my co-host today, I'm just going to ask our fabulous panel to introduce themselves, starting with Abhi.
Hey all, thanks Jackie. Abhi Nithyanand, Head Up Advisory at RE Hub, so working both with project developers, wholesalers and end users on renewable energy contracting.
Thank you, Abhi. And next to Josh.
Hi everyone, Josh Sucharov from IFM Investors. I sit in our asset management team in Melbourne and have been leading our corporate power purchase buying program for the last few years.
Thanks, Josh. Aylin.
Thanks, Jackie. Aylin Cunsolo, partner at Baker and McKenzie. I work across the energy sector for all market participants. One of my specialisations is PPAs, work on both the corporate buyer, retailer and seller side, and have been active in the BRC-A for several years as well.
And finally, Tristan.
Yeah, g'day. Tristan Edis from Green Energy Markets. Our business has been tracking supply and demand for LGCs stretching back to the early 2000s.
Fantastic. So over to you, Chris, for question 1.
Great, thanks, Jackie. We'll dive right into it. So as Jackie mentioned in the introduction, I think one of the key trends of interest at the moment is the relatively high prices. LGC prices were expected really to fall to $10 or less, I think, after 2020 and the RET, but they have climbed up to around $50. So I think we'll start off by getting perspectives from the panel on what's going on here. Why are prices remaining so high? What do you see as the factors here? Maybe to Tristan or Aylin for a first perspective.
I might defer to Aylin to start with and hear what he's got to say, and I'll jump in with a few views.
I'll jump in, yeah. So yeah, I guess going back to what the RET was created for, an LGCs were typically set up as a subsidiary to assist with renewable energy development, and a lot of the initial pricing perspectives were based on the RET. And the RET was, and the $10 prices were on the back of the RET being met. So as Jackie suggested earlier, a lot of the voluntary demand is pushed up some of that pricing and those forecasts materially. And in addition to it, I guess, just in the more nearer term, I think some supply side issues such as generation constraints and delayed generation and delayed new build has also had some impact on the relative front end, which I'm sure Tristan will jump into more detail about. But on a broader perspective and the rest of the decade, a lot of the upcoming demand from voluntary markets and also 2 key new demand perspectives of EVs and green hydrogen are also other factors that might have a role to play. Tristan?
Yeah, look, I'm one of those analysts that's been getting it wrong, expecting the LGC price to fall. And one of the key reasons for why it hasn't fallen in the short term was that the process of commissioning new projects took far longer than what people expected. So we were doing continuous write-downs every single month on expected LGC supply within the year that we were in. So for example, in 2020, we were consistently going through each month and downgrading supply by 500,000 to 1 million LGCs for the given year. And so we were misforecasting LGC creation within the year that we were doing the forecast. It was that bad in terms of the commissioning delays, seeing whole projects fully built, everything in place, and generating not a single unit of electricity because AEMO was not happy with their performance and not allowing them to export, and then seeing them go through horrible delays as they tried to get through their commissioning hold points. So in the short term, we have a very good explanation for why prices have been far higher than what we thought, which was that the supply wasn't there that we expected. But in the later dated period, so the sort of 2024 onwards, there has been this explanation of, well, voluntary demand is far higher than what anyone had anticipated, and that's absolutely true, it is. But so is supply, because new projects kept on getting announced. And so when we look at the numbers, we've done a huge upgrade in voluntary demand. You know, it's now getting sort of closer to 20,000 gigawatt hours, which is huge if you went back a few years ago. But even with this huge injection of voluntary demand, supply still exceeds demand by a comfortable margin by 2024. Now, obviously, we haven't included all voluntary demand. We're tracking what we know about. And many of the people listening on this webinar may be thinking they're going to contract new LGCs that I don't have in my model. But we go through the ENGES list of all major consumers, and you start running out of major consumers that are happy to pay a premium for their electricity. When you start getting to aluminium smelters and large steel mills, they're not happy to pay a significant premium, you know, of anything really above, I would have thought, $10, maybe $20 a megawatt hour. So when I look at that and I look at forward pricing, I can't reconcile the two. So I'm hoping I might learn something out of this webinar about information that I don't have about why the maybe demand and supply are closer matched than what I'm currently estimating.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you know, the activities of market are even stumping some of our top experts. So thanks, Tristan. That was really great detailed answer. I guess just, you know, it's a little bit of an extrapolation of the first question. Back to Abhi, so you really touched on a little bit in the first piece there, but what are the key factors shaping the LGC market, and how long can buyers expect high LGC prices to continue?
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. I'm just going to share my screen to kick off this question. Can you see my screen there?
Yep.
So yeah, just pulling off directly from our core markets platform on the current forward curve for LGCs, and looking at the graph going from left to right, you have time starting from July last year all the way through to today, and each line here represents the LGC price for a certain year. So as you can see, these curves have risen materially in the last 12 months. So just using Cal 25, or the LGC price for 2025, started off at $15 12 months ago and has now risen to nearly $37. And similarly, some of the back end, even calendar year 2030, was $8.50 at the start of the year or end of last year, and it's currently risen to $16. So these are material increases we're seeing in the secondary market and the traded market. And coming back, I'll just stop sharing my screen. Coming back to it, I guess, yeah, just going to the NEM in itself, the NEM's are 180 terawatt hours, out of which about 140 comes from the business side. And if you remove even a large portion of it, we're still talking about corporate usage of over 100 terawatt hours. And the moment you start looking at voluntary demand coming in there, and a lot of conversations we're having with end users who typically you wouldn't associate with as being a really large energy user looking at going green are. So yeah, adding to that 20 terawatt hours that Tristan's already got in his model, we believe that there's a fair bit more coming into the market, with key dates of 2025 and 2030 being underpinning a lot of net zero targets. And in addition to it, I guess, as I touched on earlier, you've got electric vehicles that are potentially going to come in, and it's very unlikely that you'd have a EV charging company that's going to give non-green energy to charge either. So that demand's going to come in along with potential green hydrogen. Timing might be more towards the end of the decade or early parts of the next decade, but that's another demand position. And I guess from a supply side as well, there is a material change or delay in projects, as Tristan alluded to, and that's not gone away very quickly, but also costs of building these projects have increased. So the raw materials and the raw metal and anything that goes in has gone up. Cost of debt has gone up. So again, from the supply side perspective, some of these costs are also rising, which needs to be met with some kind of either increase in energy costs or LGC costs or both, to also get some of the projects more to get over the line.
Yeah, thanks, Abhi. Tristan, did you have anything to add there, I guess? And obviously that really challenging question of how long can buyers expect high prices to remain, and I guess we're seeing a little bit of that in the forward pricing in those future vintages. But any other sort of thoughts around that?
Yeah, look, one of the things that we need to be a little bit careful about is, at the moment, we report a lot on brokered market prices, and the brokered market is a small proportion of the total market, and it is generally it's actually quite a liquid market. You know, when you compare it to, you know, major exchange listed shares, the volume is quite small, and so we need to be careful not to put too much weight on that brokered market price. There is another market that's going on there with large buyers and sellers going direct to each other, and some of them will be looking at, you know, terms of wanting to do deals of far longer terms, you know, a 10-year deal. And for many of them, you know, they might be very happy with a deal that gives them $15 for an LGC, but gives it over a stretch of 10 years. And what it says to me is, we just need to be a little bit careful that sometimes what we see in the brokered market may not actually reflect underlying demand supply fundamentals, but rather some short-term influences, and the fact that maybe some of the large players just choose to sit it out because they don't necessarily aren't too bothered, and they know if they entered in with volume, then the opportunities or the differentials that they can see would rapidly collapse. And so we just need to be a little bit careful of putting a lot of weight on a brokered market price that doesn't reflect the vast majority of the volume that's out there.
And you can imagine that side of the market too will probably be increasing as well. So you know, it'd be very interesting to see what happens there. So yeah, so just moving on then, a little bit of a different perspective now. Understanding what the implications are for PPA buyers. Obviously increased prices are one, but and what strategies are parties using in deals, you know, such as maybe delaying retirement until you know, greenhouse target dates, etc. What sort of strategies, and what does it mean for you? And I think I'll invite Josh to speak here from IFM, who've obviously recently executed a major procurement.
Great, thanks, Jackie. Hi all. Yeah, I think I might start with talking about the strategies side of things before moving on to the implications around pricing for the PPAs. So we looked at securing power purchase agreements for our assets in our Australian Infrastructure Fund located on the NEM, so the east coast of Australia. And the objective really was to, how do we, I guess, secure energy for our assets at a good price for the long term? but also how do we do it in a sustainable manner? And that's where looking at a group buying PPA came into play. Obviously, as investors, we take a long-term view. And so although energy procurement is not sort of a core function for a lot of our assets, we were keen to partner with them to sort of push and encourage them to invest in taking a long-term view, which involved a retail PPA at the end of the day. The implications, I guess, for that, pros and cons. Taking scale to market, we were able to get access to some projects through retailers where the pricing was palatable and the business cases stacked up for each asset to take to sort of their own management and boards. The certainty around the structure. So our assets, we were encouraged to achieve net zero targets, and we strongly work with our assets around encouraging them on multiple projects, both scope 1 and 2. And what the PPA really did was allow them to review more of a holistic utility strategy and have the PPA as a cornerstone to achieving net zero targets. Originally, they were sort of all around the net zero 2050 based on sort of the science-based target model. And we've had some outcomes where net zero targets now in the 2030s and 2025s of some of these larger users. It also allowed assets to focus on other areas by signing a long-term contract. The implications meant that they were able to point resources into other areas of the business that required focus. So from our perspective, it's been a really interesting project, both from what we thought we were starting on the journey to where we are now. Other implications, I guess, from our perspective, is that it depends on what an asset wants to try and achieve, or a business. Obviously, every business has its own targets and own objectives. And so it was working with those to understand how to best utilise what the assets had and their advantages, but also understand where the gaps were for them and help them plug that. The pricing perspective has been an interesting one. We started this journey before COP26, and we really saw an increase from other corporates moving into the market and looking to sign up long-term power purchase agreements sort of following that date. And this probably goes back to sort of question one around the corporate demand, or the significant increase in corporate demand. We're only just starting to see some of the bigger sort of listed companies sort of make these announcements and looking to secure power purchase agreements to help with that scope 2 piece. But there's a whole unlisted base, and even the mid-market consumers that will really continue to move in that space. Investors are wanting it, and I think it's a movement in Australia where now corporate and management are starting to sort of not wake up to it, but actually make significant steps to locking in these longer term energy contracts.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Josh, and it's real leadership from your organisation shown there, and help, leading that process with those assets. And obviously we've noticed the same thing, a huge boom in mainstream, Australian CNI following suit. So that's fantastic. Over to Aylin, obviously, with your experience in the contract space, you'd be seeing, a range of different approaches to, look at dealing with this current situation. Can you give us a little bit of an idea for your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, both Josh and Tristan have touched on this. The high prices of LGCs are essentially driving buyers to lock in a long-term deal to get price certainty for LGCs as well as supply certainty. So there are quite a few procurement options for achieving this. One common one is a bundled PPA. So under this agreement, the buyer would procure LGCs and other green products created by a particular project, and that's combined with, if it's a CFD, a swap on the electricity. In that situation, your LGC price will be bundled into the bundled price for electricity and green, or there could be a split price. Another common option that we're seeing, and probably increasingly so, is rolling in long-term supply of LGCs into a retail agreement, which I think is the structure that Josh has used. So that'll be a standard retail agreement, but for a longer period, where the buyer is procuring LGCs from one project or multiple projects. And there can be a bit of flexibility in that structure in how you receive the LGC. So, for example, the retailer could retain a quantity of LGCs which is referable to the mandatory quantity, the quantity that needs to be surrendered to meet the liability of the retailer under the RET in respect to their customers' consumption. Surrender those, and then the balance could be either voluntary surrendered on behalf of the buyer, which is often preferable for a corporate buyer that doesn't want the administration of having to do it themselves, or the balance could get transferred to the buyer. The other structure that we are seeing, and probably increasingly so, is an LGC only long-term agreement, and it might be LGC and green rights. Corporate buyers will look to this structure, particularly where they've got voluntary targets. They might be happy with their retail contracts, or maybe they've already entered into a bundled PPA, but they just want certainty that they can meet the 100% renewable target, so they're procuring extra LGCs. From a project perspective, this type of agreement would usually complement an existing bundled PPA. So perhaps it's on they've got merchant, 20% merchant black, and the LGC offtake is to complement the merchant aspect. We also see combinations as well. For example, I've seen a bundled PPA which has a period which is LGC only, and the remainder bundled. So lots of different approaches in the market.
That's fantastic. Thanks very much, Aylin. It's a really good comprehensive list there, and we've certainly seen an increase in LGC only contracting as well. And also really great for supporting new projects. So that's great. So just moving on now, I'll hand back over to Chris to ask a question of Abhi.
Thank you. Yeah, so we've heard of, I guess, a range of longer term forward strategies there, but another one that we're interested in hearing about are the benefits or costs or risks to consider in buying in strips or future vintages of LGCs. So Abhi, if you could give us a bit of a run through there.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think it probably touches a bit on what Tristan was saying and Josh was saying about locking in some of that LGC prices for the future. So as highlighted in the graph earlier, pricing is really having current backwardation, whereby the prices for every calendar year is probably dropping off, or is dropping off materially, where the price for Cal 30 is now closer to $15. So what corporates can, or any business can essentially do, is look to lock away that price now for a given volume, and I guess have budget certainty on what that additional green element for their costs are and how much it's going to cost them to go 100% renewable or X% renewable. And similarly on the project side, with any project, it's locking in some revenue, while it may not be the same spot level of where the market is today, it also provides that certainty of having X amount of revenue. And I guess strips would also give you the ability to smoothing out some of that price. So you may not have to face that immediate hit of a significant $50 LGC price for 2023 or 2024, if you can potentially smooth some of that over to the end of the decade. And I guess some businesses are also looking at green product rights beyond that to go into the 2030s. And I'm sure Aylin will talk more about how the mechanisms of that would work, but essentially smooth out some of that lower price green products beyond 2030 as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so you touched, I guess, on one of the issues facing buyers who want to go long term, which is, of course, the RET, the renewable energy target, finishes in 2030, which creates a level of uncertainty. So it'd be good to get, I guess, an answer from Aylin and Tristan to some extent on what are the implications for PPA buyers. So I guess starting with Aylin, what strategies are you seeing clients taking to deal with the end of the RET? and managing that uncertainty from a contractual perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So, I mean, until recently, most buyers were contracting for LGCs or entering into bundled PPAs up until the expiry of the RET. But now as we get closer, that strategy isn't working anymore. It's not long enough to be able to meet the corporate's own sustainability targets. And from a project perspective, you need at least 8 to 10 years for a PPA, an anchor PPA at least, in order to secure financing. So there are strategies to deal with the uncertainty of the RET. The most common is in a PPA, whether that be a bundled PPA or a supply-led or retailer PPA, there is a mechanism that says that if the RET expires or is otherwise repealed, then the customer will get whatever replaces that scheme. If nothing replaces it, then the customer is essentially getting the notional emission reduction benefit or a contractual right to the green products that might exist in the future, or if nothing, the emission reduction benefit. That contractual right alone should be enough for the corporate buyer with voluntary targets to be able to meet their objectives, their sustainability objectives. It's not as ideal. A certificate-based scheme is more verifiable and transparent, but we do expect if the RET is not replaced, then having an exclusive contractual right will be enough. We tend to build in provisions into our agreements that require the projects or the sellers to be able to, or requires them to help the buyer verify and meet its reporting requirements. For example, by providing a certificate that says you have contracted exclusive right to LGC or green products up until the end of the term, and that should be enough. So under a PPA, if the RET expires, there will be no price change to the green products that the customer is buying, and that's from, at least for a bankable PPA, that's a fundamental principle because banks need certainty of price. It can be a little bit daunting for a corporate customer to think, well, if nothing is replacing it, am I continuing to pay the same price for nothing? But what you are getting is that notional emission reduction benefit that should allow you to meet your targets, and you also get the potential upside. So if the RET is repealed and replaced with something else and that commodity is more valuable, then under a typical PPA, you won't be exposed to any price increase. So you'll be getting the benefit of that. That's how it's typically structured. In an LGC only agreement, it's a little less clear because that's all just about the LGCs and it will depend on negotiation. It might be that the buyer has an option to buy the replacement products if there are any after the expiry of the RET. There could be a price reset, but I have also seen LGC and green products agreements where it's structured in the same way as a bundled PPA, in that there's no price change and the customer gets whatever's available, whether that be a notional contractual right or a tradable commodity.
Yeah, interesting. So contractual solutions are kind of managing the uncertainty or moving into the void, really, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly.
To meet it, whatever happens. I guess a follow-up question for either you or Tristan: do we need to see a guarantee of origin scheme or something equivalent? I mean, you've mentioned that parties are contracting to deal with it, but ideally, would we see a guarantee of origin scheme or something equivalent to provide that certification?
I'm happy to jump in.
Yep.
So what Aylin has outlined is there is a straightforward legal solution there. I think what everyone forgets is that we had a green power scheme before we had LGCs, and so government worked around a certification process for green electricity before LGCs existed. I think there is obviously an issue there. If you want to then trade them, you don't just want to use them for a voluntary purpose. You want to actually, perhaps your electricity demand goes down and you've contracted a certain volume and you want to on-sell them to someone else, then it's probably going to be more difficult under an arrangement where you're dealing with legal contracts rather than a nice, straightforward, tradable instrument certified by the government. But putting it all aside, I mean, it's really ridiculous to think that we wouldn't, after 2030, that governments would not move to provide some kind of certification process for zero emission electricity in one way or another, whether that be certifying some kind of carbon abatement or just continuing with the existing scheme. It's absolutely ridiculous to think that governments would not want to provide some mechanism for recognising that some electrons are actually cleaner than others. And I think the only reason why anyone was worried about this was because Angus Taylor used to be the Energy Minister, and we had the prior government in place that seemed to have some kind of allergic reaction to the idea of renewable energy. So this should be solved in this term of Parliament, I would have thought. And yeah, this guarantee of origin concept, you call it whatever you want, but basically an ongoing certification regime for renewable electricity should continue. And ideally what we should have is an emissions abatement recognition for electricity. That's what we really should have. And it seems crazy that Australia might implement an emissions trading scheme that excludes electricity. That's what we're looking at right now under the current Labor government policy, which is absolutely just stupid. So I would like to think that eventually we'll get over this allergic reaction that belongs to the Tony Abbotts of this world, and we'll move on, and we will put in place a sound legal framework for rewarding low emission electricity or emissions abatement from electricity generation. It just seems ludicrous that we wouldn't do it.
Yeah, I understand the Clean Energy Regulator is working on a guarantee of origin scheme at a minimum, but your comment, I think, leads into the final question from Jackie.
Pardon me, sorry about that. Yeah, so I guess what would you like to see from a future scheme, and what would you recommend to C&I energy buyers seeking to meet net zero carbon targets when looking at the LGC markets and the RET, the current scheme? Who would like to have a go at that one?
I'm happy to jump in first. Yeah, look, I mean, although there have been contractual solutions that have been come up with, a government-run scheme like the RET is the preferable. There are limitations with the contractual solutions, which Tristan has touched on, especially in the context where it's a secondary sale. So where you're contracting directly with the project, it's simpler. But if you are acquiring LGCs under a retail agreement, for example, and the retailer doesn't own the project, it might be difficult to be able to transfer that benefit to the buyer if there isn't actually a tradable commodity or a certificate-based scheme. So what I would like to see fundamentally is something that looks like the RET, in that it's run by the government, it's transparent, it gives confidence to buyers as well as to investors and financiers. I think there's opportunity to explore, what this new RET would look like, and some couple of ideas that I've heard that have been discussed is one is essentially an extension of the scheme, but without the mandatory target, which allows the voluntary market to be able to continue to use LGCs. The other, and I've noticed there's a few questions in the Q&A that relates to this, is looking at how can the RET or its replacement support a 24/7 renewable commitment? Can there be something, a certificate-based scheme that would allow corporates and potentially retailers to be able to achieve emission reductions on a 24-hourly basis, and in that way encourage investment in firming technologies like batteries. So I think that's certainly a very interesting idea, which I'd like to see explored.
Definitely. And any other thoughts on that from the panel?
Yeah, I guess just echoing a lot of what Aylin said, and also from a commercial market perspective, got to remember there's a lot of deals that are also expiring at the end of 2030. So it's almost a new certificate cliff that the market's going to be hitting, and with a lot of businesses again setting out targets for 25 and 30 and not wanting to take on some of that policy risk as well. Also signing more deals out to 2030, I think having some kind of certainty around an extension or an extension of a RET or something like that, similar to what Aylin was saying, would be very useful as well to provide certainty to some of these really large users underpinning a lot of the contracts. And I guess just answering your second bit, a lot of it will come down to advanced planning. And we found is when we worked with Josh as well, is more of planning and setting out a strategy prior to going and trying to get something to be signed off right at the 11th hour. So it's more of coming to Tristan's point on LGC pricing, making sure the businesses fully understands pricing, risk, structures, and so on, even before you go and start trying to sign a contract. So a lot of upfront strategies is something that we definitely recommend to anyone looking at reducing their footprint.
Sorry to leap in there, Josh. Yeah, how did you find that process internally?
Yeah, I think the main thing is making sure that there's clarity, both from a policy perspective, but also from understanding, I guess, solely speaking from a buyer's perspective, that understanding, if you're taking a long-term view, what is the policy, what is the framework that you're committing to for the long term, and ensuring that when you're seeking, I guess, approvals for taking a long-term contract, that your business case and your assumptions, out to 2030 and beyond are going to be still the same assumptions there. And if not, is there going to be a bit of a carryover scheme or a bit of a bridge to whatever new policy or framework comes into place? I think that's something that needs to happen. Obviously, there's a big movement now, and there's a lot of momentum, both from a corporate buyer's perspective, but also from a developer and investor perspective. And with the coal exiting the market in the next decade, and renewables definitely being the sort of the primary investment or the primary supplier for energy, especially across the NEM, it's to ensure that both you don't lose confidence and we don't sort of have a vacuum of policy, which I guess leaves a void and a vacuum for investment and continual offtakes.
Great, thanks, Josh. Tristan, any final comments there before we quickly move on to the list? We've got 27 questions. We'll try and get through as many as we can in a minute. But yes, please.
Yeah, look, if I was chatting to some buyers, I think the front of mind issue that you need to be thinking about is additionality is going to be the fundamental issue. This government has to confront a question, which is if they create an emissions trading scheme of some kind that does allow electricity in, do they allow, and they're not going to go for cap and trade, they want to go for some kind of baseline and credit mechanism. There's a issue there where you say, well, do I want to allow a whole heap of projects that have been that were built many, many years ago that are allowed to produce LGCs now, but do I allow them to produce some kind of abatement certificate entitlement into the future? And because I don't need to, they're built. Why would I give them any extra money? They've done well. I set up the RET and we've given them plenty of rewards. And why should we continue to give them ongoing gains when we need to just we could just concentrate on new supply? And the moment, if they make that decision, then the value of an LGC will it hits a sort of junction point. The other point, though, is that will hit in 2030 anyway, because a whole heap of supply, which is locked up with mandatory demand with retailers, disappears. And so all that supply that was heading into electricity retailers is now going to get freed up and becomes available for the voluntary market if we don't change anything. And then we have a price disjoint plummeting thing. The other thing is rooftop solar doesn't produce LGCs right now. They've produced STCs. Now, I think there's a reasonable argument for rooftop solar owners to make that, well, my system's still operating after 2030. I only got STCs to deemed generation up to 2030. I'm still producing abatement after 2030. I want to create LGCs now, or some other kind of guarantee of origin abatement certificate. That is a huge amount of extra supply that comes on in 2030 potentially. So it's, you know, if you're doing this for the right reasons, you're doing it because you want to contribute to the environment and you want to get a PR reward, then I would say, and you're not fundamentally too worried about the price of these certificates in the future, you just try and lock in the lowest cost deal you can right now, well, that's fine. But if you're worried about the future ongoing value of these and how it looks, you know, many years into the future, because maybe you actually don't want to follow through on 100% renewables and you want to sell some of them in the future, well, that's where things are very murky and tricky. Yeah, so additionality, it can't be avoided, and this government needs to deal with that issue around new projects versus old projects, and how long can you continue to generate an LGC, and is there some kind of cut-off point where you say, look, you guys have had your fun and you've made good money, and now, you know, you're no longer eligible. So that's a question that's outstanding that government will probably have to grapple with at one point or another.
Yeah, there are definitely some challenges to be solved there in a government scheme. Chris, were you about to?
Yeah, no, thanks, Tristan. I think, I mean, it's quite common to hear people talk about business cases where in the latter years they almost discount LGCs to low prices or even zero. And there's a lot of history of course, environmental markets. When they get to their end date, you get some price instability that people should consider about, and something for government to try and smooth that pathway when we get to around 2030. So we've got a lot of questions, which is fantastic. So I'm going to try and bundle a few up and answer a few in groups. We got a few questions around LGC only deals, questions about why would people do this, why are they increasing, and about the risk of being accused of greenwashing by NGOs. Does the panel have a view? I think maybe Aylin and Abhi might want to take this question.
Yeah, sure. We're just starting with the greenwashing. Yeah, it's the LGCs are representation of the emission reduction benefit of a project. It's certified by a regulator, government-backed, transparent. There's a lot of vigor around the process. So it's in fact it's the LGCs that give you the verifiable green claim, and that's quite clear from the ACCC guidance. So I don't think there's a greenwashing risk with buying LGCs and where you are genuinely retiring them to meet your sustainability targets and following the reporting guidance. Where the risk is if you were to enter into a PPA on the black without acquiring the LGCs and then make emission reduction claims around that, because the emission reduction benefit is linked to the LGC, someone else can then take the LGC and make those claims, and then there's a double counting. So that's where I do see the risk, and you need to be careful with the black only PPA. There's some very specific claims you can make around that, but you need to be careful around the emission reduction. Obviously, if you're entering into LGC agreement with an operating project, then that's really coming into the question of are you contracting and creating additionality through underpinning a new project? But I think that's a slightly different point, and you just something else to be aware of.
I guess just adding to that, with most voluntary renewable contracts being written on the back of some kind of mechanism and some kind of standards, and looking at SBTi, which is typically seen as a very high standard for businesses' decarbonization journeys. SBTi actually recognize LGCs as a renewable source and therefore a reduction mechanism and not an offsetting mechanism. So I think with the details that's being looked at over there as well, kind of shows that it may not be seen as greenwashing to the level that people are fearing it could be.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and sorry, Chris, just to add to that, what we've seen in the market for corporates is that some of the corporates do have longer term, I guess, sort of traditional black contracts, and might want to meet a target earlier, and that's where you do see buying an LGC only component in the early days before looking at reviewing a full-blown sort of energy and LGC component. So there are sort of ways that some corporates look at this and want to go early with some of their targets that they've set.
Yeah, sound advice. There are a couple of other questions, I guess, around uncertainties in 2030 that I'll bundle together as well. One question about whether if a PPA is included to include all future revenues, would this include potential capacity credits that might be created under new legislation? And another question asking, could it be by 2030 the cost of creating a certificate is less than the value, and what percentage of renewables does the certificate become redundant? So a couple of transition questions there. Maybe the first one I think is clearly for Aylin, but if anyone else has a view on the other question about at what point, what percentage of renewables do we still need certificates?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously it depends on what your contract says, but where I'm acting for a buyer in the PPA, we would always make sure that there's a provision that says that if capacity credits become available, then that is for the buyer's account, and that makes sense in the context where the general principle is that the buyer is taking on the spot risk, but also the revenue associated with the electricity generated by the project, which is volatile, and in return is paying the fixed price to the generator, and that's what the benefit is that the project's getting, is a certain fixed price that it can then use to get financing. It also recognises that the buyer, whether that be a corporate buyer or a retailer, will ultimately be the one that has the liability, whether that is directly or indirectly, to procure the capacity credits. So again, it's appropriate that the right sits with the buyer.
Great, thank you. The second question, and I might add a couple of others because we've had a few questions around 24/7, which were partly answered before. But at what point do we need certificates? One question is, how will the push for 24/7 match affect the LGC market? In fact, there's a couple of questions there about the future LGCs. Will LGCs become obsolete and be replaced by the core principle of 24/7? So views on the implications of 24/7 matching trends, and I guess the point at which we have a lot of renewables, the certificates. Will LGCs have a longer lifetime with these trends coming through?
I have a strong opinion on 24/7. I think it's a stupid idea. We saw a number of corporates in the early days try and do this beautiful matching thing where they wanted a perfectly hedged product with, but they wanted to do it with a large project developer. So they was trying to bypass electricity retailers and going direct to the project developer. And the project developer found that really difficult to give them a perfectly hedged product. They were saying, can't you just give me a nice 10-year, 15-year deal for the LGCs and the power, and then I can go to the banks and get my project up. And I think a lot of people realised, look, this is actually, what we'll do is We'll handle our electricity purchases and hedging our electricity purchases through our retailer. And then we'll do a separate deal with a project developer where we'll buy the LGCs and a CFD product essentially that gives us some degree of hedging for the power. And we won't mix the two. And now with this 24/7 concept, we're kind of forgetting those issues and trying to come up with something that could be really horribly complex when we've got two markets. We've got a sort of abatement certificate market, LGC market here, which deals with the issue of trying to decarbonise. And then we've got another market called the electricity market, which deals with this issue of the time value of energy. And in the end, the time value concept in the wholesale market feeds into and rewards renewable generators that can supply power when it's most needed. And they see that signal really loud and clear because they can go up to $15,000 a megawatt hour. And I think some people have kind of got this simplistic idea, oh, I'm buying an electron right now, I need to get it at exactly the same time in order to make a difference. No, you're trying to reduce emissions. Who cares when that happens? As long as it reduces emissions. That's what that's about. The electricity market is then trying to signal matching of an electron with a time of day need for it, and that can go up to $15,000 a megawatt hour. Let it do its job, okay? Don't try and do all this internally within your own corporate. It's stupid. It's going to result in too high a cost to deliver the solution. Let the market as a whole solve for those two separate challenges. That's the way I look at those two issues. Those two markets can co-optimize by operating independently of each other, but they will interact with each other through the fact that the generator will see both a wholesale value and an abatement value, and then they will co-optimize for those two.
A really interesting perspective there. Sorry, I jumped in before you, Chris.
That's all right. I was going to say, I feel like you've rung the opening bell for a future webinar topic, and we'll organise a 24/7 cage match or something for people to spend an hour thrashing it out.
In fact, we have one planned, and I was going to talk to that at the end of the session. But that's great. Good lead into that, Tristan. Does anyone else have anything to offer on that topic? Obviously, Tristan's quite passionate about. Any other thoughts?
I guess just conscious of time, but also bearing in mind, having worked with some of the corporates, also often they look at residual emissions and using energy and what is your PPA doing. So if you sign a solar PPA, where all the generations in the middle of the day where the emission intensity is also quite low in any case, how much are you really abating from the grid is a question which we've seen a lot of our clients ask, and they often are willing to pay a premium in order to have that real marginal intensity come down. So I guess, would be keen to have a follow-on conversation with Tristan challenging some of those points there.
Fantastic. Thank you. We'll get that cage match idea going, Chris. Apologies, we'll have to end it there. I just want to say thanks so much to everybody, to Abhi, Josh, Aylin and Tristan, and my co-host, Chris. And the recording for this will be available on our website in the next day or so. And so watch out for all of those things I mentioned, upcoming webinars, cage fight, boot camps, everything coming in the next little while. And if you're going to the Industrial Net Zero Conference at the end of August, we will be there as well. So we will see you there.
One final point, I think, before you go, we were asked also to mention that there is a review of the green power scheme at the moment. We didn't get to some of those questions, but interested parties should have a look at the discussion paper currently out on the future of green power, because obviously that'll have a big impact on LGCs and other issues as well.
Absolutely. My apologies for getting that one. Thanks very much, Chris. And thanks very much, and apologies to those we didn't get quite to your questions. Shoot them through to the BRC. We are happy to have a chat with you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.